it? Okay, yeah, good.
I already did. And I will give everybody, like if we need to share screen or anything, just let me know and I'll make you co-host to be able to enable that. But yeah, welcome everybody to our Distance Unlearning Hour. And thank you, Daniel and Shell, for being here with us today for the kind of processing reflection on a very powerful workshop that we experienced last week with you guys. Daniel, I did want to introduce you to Andrew. Andrew Mitchell is our GRA for the Cachawidecuna project. So he has been coming to a lot of the sessions. And Alana Radlazur was our former GRA for the project. She has taken a postdoc or a fellowship in LA, but continues to be connected to our project. Tamarin is, as she was saying before, in arts, administration, education, and policy, a student of Richard Fletcher's. And Luther, who I see on here, is, hi Luther. So Luther is a graduate student in comp studies, but he has done his undergraduate at OSU. He is also a groundskeeper at the Ohio State University, so maybe a great connection to the land. And he has participated in the Andean Music Ensemble for many, many semesters on end. So I think that that's sort of and for those of the participants who don't know you, I will let Daniel and Shell just introduce yourselves.
Great. Well, it's really lovely to be here for the conversation and not be responsible for leading a workshop. I mean, we love leading workshops, but it's also, as those who, I mean, I'm sure all of you have led groups, it's kind of nice just to sit back and process talking. But yeah, so I'm the co-founder and director of La Fundación Pachaysana, and Chel is our program coordinator and also resident director for our study abroad program, our semester-long study abroad program called Rehearsing Change. And the work that we're doing in Ecuador is similar to what you are doing in this conversation. It's really about unlearning. It's really about challenging ourselves, challenging the communities with whom we work, because our programs are all based in communities in which we work with communities and design them with communities, and then invite international students or international interns to participate in those programs. But it's about challenging what learning really means, what knowledge means, and how through programming and through a long process of thinking about how we can change education, how do we work towards one, a much more ethical and reciprocal way of doing education, but also how do we liberate ourselves to a certain degree through an unlearning process from these oppressive structures that we all feel in many different ways, of course. Chel, would you like to complement that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Chel, or Chelsea. And I was born and raised here in Ecuador, but my mom is from the States. So I lived in the States for a little bit. Yeah, all of my life I've sort of been like in this in-between sort of space that has allowed me a lot of, yeah, space to challenge and question, like, why are things the way, like, why is my mom so different from my dad? Like, it's not like I always had this one truth of how things should be. And I'm really passionate about the use of art for like social change and justice. And I think that's a part of the work that we do that I find really invigorating, because when we think about, you know, resisting to like dominant structures of oppression, you know, the resisting is like really hard and is really important to like be in that act of resisting, you know, and being like, I don't want that, right? But it can also be really draining, and it can be really like exhausting, and like you hear a lot of like burnout and all of these things. And I think that through creating art with one another, where you maybe like have a space to reimagine how you want to do things, or maybe or maybe even like to criticize the dominant structure and it continue. But if when you engage your creativity with other people and build relationship, I find it like extremely life-giving. So yeah, so I think yeah, I'd like to say that. And then just something else that has recently been really present and something that I've definitely learned through the work with Pachaysana in the communities is like relationship with land, and how like that's also a praxis, you know? Like I think for a really long time I was like, yeah, you know, like Mother Earth, and like Earth is alive, but to actually, you know, get your hands dirty and like plant something and take care of a plant. So I'm really also interested in how our concepts of justice and can then maybe be expressed in ways that you can actually like bring them to reality. So yeah, I guess that's what I would like to share.
Thank you. So Richard, do you want to kick off our Unlearning Hour today, our distance Unlearning Hour?
Sure. So, I mean, I think we do want to spend some time today reflecting on last week. I must say that my own experience of last week and reflecting, and actually both sessions that we've had so far with the Pachaysana workshop, has been an immediate sense of kind of gratitude and wanting to somehow be in that moment for longer. But then as the week wears on, as work intervenes, a feeling of it's hard to get back to that place. So actually even the structure that we're working with, I find slightly counterproductive to the reflecting a week later. Because you know, to get back into that moment again is difficult. And that's why I thought, so in addition to reflecting on last week, and also the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, so Alana, you weren't there last week. I'm just trying to think if anyone else, was everyone else there last week? I think so.
Andrew was there, and yeah. Cameron, and
I'm not sure.
Luther was not, but
I was not.
Previous sessions.
Okay, so we have two people that weren't there, so I think it's kind of an interesting space, and that's what's great about this Unlearning Hour, kind of space of communication about experiences that were shared, but experiences that can be communicated. So I think we'll spend a bit of time doing that. But I just wanted to, I'm just going to share my screen a second and go to, one second, go to the Google Doc that we've created for can everyone see the Google Doc here?
We can see it.
Yeah. Now, what I've added to the Google Doc today is an exercise that I have taken. So in our Unlearning Hour last semester, one of the first kind of challenges we wanted to do was to think about kind of practical exercises or unlearning exercises. And I've been using, we were using this book, which is called Unlearning Exercises, Arts Organizations as Sites for Unlearning, which is a book of, I think it's a Dutch arts society or arts project that was focused on this. And they have a kind of synopsis of these exercises as a PDF, and I've given you the link in the document. But I've been thinking a lot about and this is related to that feeling of the week goes by and you can't get back to that kind of space that you were in. And so I've been thinking a lot about diaries. So I wanted to spend a bit of time thinking about making diaries together, kind of the tracking of time. And I also adapted one of their unlearning exercises called the Time Diary for our group. And I'll just read this for you. Between this week's session and next week's session on October 16th, make a record of your day beyond set working hours by noting down what you are doing from time to time. Together in today's session, we'll try to distinguish categories: invisible, care, productive, communicative, and intellectual for different activities, and analyze them by identifying our working habits, breaking down logics of efficiency and productivity, and recognizing other values. Next week, inspired by the call and response and poetic change of the last Pachaysana workshop, we'll read together aloud, reevaluating our day-to-day activities, especially with respect to what are normally considered unproductive moments, as well as to arrive somewhere else. And then they have this nice thing where they kind of say, what are we unlearning at this point while doing this activity? What we're unlearning here is ways of dealing with time and planning based on logics of efficiency and productivity, while undervaluing or even attempting to kill a reproductive time. Entanglement between no time, busyness, and that's a key concept in this book, busyness, and business, and struggles with different ways of working and rhythms. So this was just to kind of, and this is a proposal of us to keep track of maybe just the next few days between now. You could even just spend one, do it in detail for one day, or, how are we spending our time? How do we evaluate the time that we are using? And as I said, that there's a link here that goes straight to a PDF of some of these unlearning exercises, and maybe there's some other ones that we want to choose in future sessions. But so there's a few things. I'll just stop sharing screen. A few things that we could start with now. I think if we have that in mind, the diary, and if we have the kind of what I was saying about my reaction to returning to last week and kind of tracking of time and time getting lost, maybe we could start by reflecting a bit on the Pachaysana workshop from last week. And maybe if I could ask anyone, those of us that were there, to communicate a little bit to Tamrin and Luther, sorry, not Tamrin, sorry, Alana and Luther, what took place, and then we can start from there.
So Luther, you know a little bit about the Pachaysana workshop through our exercises in the Andean Music Ensemble. So it's interesting. I had a different experience in terms of the definitely that feeling of like wanting to stay in the space that Pachaysana created longer, But I sort of maintained that over the course of the week by bringing some of those exercises and even nuggets of terminology or words or concepts into the classes. So Luther knows that the last workshop was about the voice, and the spoken word. We attempted on chat, kind of a similar exercise, not the poetic, but just a sort of a response of like saying, what do you think? What is radical listening to you? Like, what do you think about, what does that mean? And then the assignment for the class, because we ran out of time, the assignment for the class for this week is to think about the concept of radically listening to self, to yourself, we had kind of explored listening to others, and we constantly explore that in the ensemble. And the part that I did not get to, which it was the most powerful part of the Pachaysana workshop, was radical dreaming, So we sort of explored a few of those things. We had talked about directed listening, critical listening, intentional listening, but we had not really brought in the concept of radical listening full force into the ensemble, although we've been actually practicing that, in terms of like stretching our ears with instruments that really are very different than the Western sort of like hearing range or aesthetic, For me, like the collective poetry that Shell was referring to was really powerful. Like what emerged from that in terms of this beautiful creation was incredible. And so maybe a couple of things I'll throw in, One is maybe thinking about the diaries, not just thinking about jotting down these things, right? And busyness, but also considering leisure. That leisure is different than those unlearning moments, because I think that leisure has become this, I don't know, some other type of weird space, But also thinking about the ways in which we write our thoughts down. So going back to the Pachaysana exercise of like collective writing, where sometimes they're just words or short phrases that capture something very, very affective or personal, as opposed to writing out logically, like in a in a timeline that is more consistent with like a linear, you know, sort of thing, but trying to break those models even in the ways that we write about it. That might be an interesting addition to the exercise. And maybe the other thing that I'll bring in, and this is from a different workshop about also by Pachaysana, where Daniel, you were talking about at what point did we write ourselves out of, you know, like the nature, you know, as part of nature, you know, and how do we re-inscribe ourselves in nature? How do we rewrite ourselves in? So for my Andean art, culture and society class, this week we've been reading, we finally got in, you know, we went past the pre-colonial period, and we've been reading this book that's called The Virgin of the Andes. And it goes through, it's an amazing, you know, tea table book kind of thing, but it's incredible in terms of showing what the skills of the artisans were, you know, how indigenous artists then participated in the creation of religious art. And at some moment, how they broke away as a guild from the church, you know, with a lot more freedom of interpretation. And what we see is a transformation of the Virgin Mary, you know, like, so let me find an image just to share. I'll just share it, holding it up onto the screen here. But this is the, you know, an image of the European, you know, Virgin, right? And what we see in the Andes is increasingly a bell-shaped interpretation of the Virgin Mary, right? That in the end is sort of like, I'll show you an amazing photograph of this. Hang on just one second. So that is a representation of the Virgin as an apu, as a mountain, right? As the Pachamama. And people refer to that. So this is, I don't know if you can really see this, but this is the best image, right, of the Virgin as mountain, with animals and people climbing up the mountain, the flora, right? So we start seeing a lot of elements of the aesthetics of pre-Columbian art, you know, principles of like the type of adornment that she has, representation of very specific flora, patterns, you know, that emerge, use of feathers, which was a really, really important, you know, sort of aspect. But as I saw this image, as I looked at this, it was like totally a reinscription, a rewriting of people back into nature, you know? And so, you know, those efforts, especially through art, as Shell has mentioned, you know, are there, you know, and they come from indigenous perspectives and interventions and resistance, right? And syncretism, like their participation in the syncretic, you know, sort of interpretations. And very interesting to this day, like in the work that I do, people, you know, will come to the plaza, you know, and they call it la toma de la iglesia, but everybody says it's not la toma de la iglesia, you know, because there's a tola under there. There is an indigenous site under the church. The same thing when people, in fact, this book shows how in the statues that are paraded around, actually there's a waka hidden underneath, you know, or when people sort of even bless themselves as they cross like different either caves or little nichos with saints in them in the landscape. Often if you press the issue, they'll say they're not doing that for the saint that is in the nicho, but to the nicho itself, to the little cave itself, so the sacred site or the waka, right? So those are some of the ways that I sort of brought in the discussions, both from the recent workshop, you know, with Pachaysana, and then also from the one that we did on epistemic justice. Maybe I'll invite either Andrew or Tamarin to fill in, since you guys were there at those, and Mark also was there for part of the workshop.
And it can be like, as Michelle just did, which is not necessarily describing the workshop, but describing its effect and how she took that workshop into her classes and research and these kinds of questions.
We usually have a very vocal crowd. So feel free to jump in. I strongly feel that Pachaysana has helped us create, and the Unlearning Hour, has helped us create a safe space of expression where all comments and perspectives are welcome, so please jump in. There's no criteria for contributing.
I guess I can just say through just the experience of the workshop, I guess, I really enjoyed the way that we started by like using the chat in the larger group, and Daniel like read through as we were, like, I really like that process of it kind of building and listening as well as contributing, like being able, I hadn't had an experience like that through Zoom before, and I thought it was really effective. And then as we independently worked on some of the questions that Shell brought to the table, about radical listening and radical dreaming, and doing some kind of independent writing off screen, which allowed us to, like, I guess, more freely write and then potentially edit as we then shared that with our group. I thought that was also a really great way to kind of allow us to open up, but also to be like able to share what we wanted to, and then in the group that I was in, I thought it was, at first I felt like a little overwhelmed about how are we going to actually do this. It felt like a large task to, I guess, focus from that many people down into like a single thing, like create something together. I mean, I work together when I teach with my students, but I don't personally, or haven't in the past personally, as an artist, made collective work. And so this was a great experience. I've worked collaboratively with like one other person, but with a group, it's a lot harder to wrangle. And so that process of working, I mean, we came together really quickly and actually approached each section, each kind of question that was posed in a completely different way, which I also thought was kind of amazing, that we created a structure and we're able to, we didn't just do the same thing for each section. We approached it different ways, and it felt very organic. And ultimately, yeah, like Michelle said, I was really surprised with the end result, and like creating this thing together in a very short period of time felt pretty amazing. So I appreciate the process as well. And I mean, I'm not currently teaching, but I've been thinking about these kind of, what we're doing together here as things that I can kind of move forward in my teaching and my thinking as well. So I appreciate it. Yeah.
It's great.
It was a model of, I mean, it's about thinking on your feet, right? So you guys modeled, this idea of like being able to think creatively, think on your feet, pull things together, and in a way that is rehearsing change, like that is the model, right? Of like saying, how can we be accommodating without like just sort of like getting stuck on a particular thread of ideas if they don't connect, like how do we make this happen? So I love that aspect of like really exercising the idea of like, how do we prepare ourselves for being open to that type of participation and change, Andrew, do you want to?
One element that I wanted to, could I just say one thing, Michelle? Sorry, Andrew. Just in terms of describing what we did, I think one element that we haven't mentioned, we've mentioned the radical listening and the radical dreaming. So this was, but to ignite it all, I remember that Chell described that what are los gritos? Like what are the kind of, what are you kind of trying to get out there, that like the frustrations, the kind of the cries, where are you at? So we started from quite a negative place, or a place of kind of, I guess, cleansing ourselves like from that place. And then it was about the process of listening to that moment as collective and individuals, and then kind of not correcting it, but kind of offsetting it with the kind of radical dreaming. So I think that first Los Gritos was very, that set up, that had the momentum for everything that kind of came after, which I was very grateful for. Sorry, Andrew, I just wanted to throw that in there as an important element.
Yeah, super.
No, don't worry. The thing that struck with me and stayed with me throughout the week was this idea of epistemicide. I had thought about this before, that saying and thinking about like certain worldviews that are kind of fading away or not as prioritized or emphasized, and thinking about the positives and negatives of like a global world, however we interpret that to mean. And I thought that it was wonderful that this was really universal, that each of us could take away from it and think about our own topical interests or regional interests and say, okay, how does this affect what I want to learn or what I'm teaching or what I hope to do more research on? And I thought that was really, really nice, that it wasn't just one regional focus. It wasn't just about Andean cosmology or ancient Rome or what have you, or whatever it was. I thought that was really, really great, that it was open to each of us having our own interpretations about, okay, how does this affect how I will go forth from here? So thank you.
So I had the question, just that I don't know the terminology. Can you say more about what do you mean by radical dreaming?
I mean, there's, gosh, I would hate to put any kind of definition to it, but it's basically just the idea of radicalness getting at the very fundamental nature of what's going on, right? And that the dreams that we have as individuals need to be woven together as a collective. And if we really, because it's if you think of, I think of in Ecuador we have these esteras. They're like little mats. They're woven with, and it's like it's what often are used as mattresses, for example, in many indigenous communities, and they're also used just to sit on in your house to do work on. But the idea is, this idea of radical dreaming for me is that's like the fundamental part. It's what you're sitting on. It's what holds you. It's what your base is. And so you're really having to think about weaving together different dreams to affect the fundamental space that you're in and the fundamental ways that you interconnect with each other. So that's how I would, when I think about it, and when we work on that, that's what's in my mind, at least.
Mm-hmm. For me, it was super challenging, and it sort of raised my awareness about how, when you're presented with the thing about like, what is your vision? What do you want ultimately? That I could not answer it, and so I think it really alerts us to the fact that often we get caught up in the mechanics of things, or in the like, step-by-step sort of process without that larger vision, and the importance of like really understanding the broader questions in order to be able to line everything up. That sounds a little bit too structural, but it really struck me that when put on the spot, I had a very hard time, thinking about, what does radical dreaming look like? What are we aspiring to? What are the limits for me to be able to do that? Like it kind of like my own limitations, or my own, sort of like respecting boundaries and being afraid to cross certain paths, or things like that, The other thing I wanted to maybe invite Luther to sort of chime in, if you can, Luther, is about our very different conception of the gritos related to the ensemble, because in the ensemble, this is sort of like a measure of mastery, right? Is the gritos, like, where we, in the music, they're like this, his, así, chura, chura, like this type of thing. And Luis Enrique Cachiwango, in the book that you mentioned before, you know, emphasizes the gritos, you know, so there are the guardians of the spoken word, the Arawik, you know, guardians of the spoken word, you know, as masters in the production of music making. And it's very interesting that basically the gritos are like synthetic expressions that contain a ton of meaning and information and expression, right? But if you look at the liner notes, generally, all of the liner notes for Andean music do not even mention the gritos, like they leave them out. They're not in the notation, they're not in the lyrics, and they're not in the liner notes, you know? And so the most powerful like screams, you know, they're not screams, they're calls, you know, call, and it's not even call and response, it's call and repetition, you know, so if somebody calls it and then people repeat it, you know, they say like Shinazami Kanchik, you know, or Karikuna, you know, like, so we are men, you know, like that. And then one person will call it and then it's repeated, right? So this very, very powerful aspect that even has a guardian of the spoken word, you know, that masters that repertoire of gritos, right, is completely left out of Western appreciation, notation, anything. You know, they're silenced, completely silenced, non-existent, right? If we, only when we hear the recording can we hear them, you know, but other than that, they're not notated anywhere. So I don't know, Luther, you've experienced the gritos, and I don't know if you have some perspective on that from the ensemble.
I try to avoid the gritos. No, just kidding. So I've always wondered with the gritos, because you have them in different types of music. So I've always kind of wondered, like, what makes them different? You know, what makes gritos in the Andean region different from ones that you may hear in music coming out of Mexico or things like that, and what ties them all together. So, but for me personally, even though I hold back when I probably shouldn't, it's more of, I don't know how to explain it. It's more of engaging with what's going on. It's vocalizing, bringing forth something that's internal that I'm feeling, and just, I don't know, and I don't want to, how do I put it, kind of like disrespect the music, because, you know, am I the right person that's supposed to be doing a grito? I know that we are, you always tell us to, that, you know, go ahead and express, but I don't want to do like a disservice, I think, to the music and the, those who created the music that we are reproducing. So I think that's part of what makes me hold back, but I really do enjoy them. And even when I'm listening to my Spotify list with my Andean music that I have on there while I'm working, I will let a grito fly.
Oh, that's so cute.
So, but that's kind of my experience with them, just to share.
Yeah. We had done an experiment with people in the ensemble going out to nature, and I think that this is where, you know, in our little recording that we did of one of our practices, this is where this grito comes from. So I'll just play it so you guys can hear it. So I just wanted to play that little piece, right? But that was one of our members of our ensemble who went outside, and he did this grito and recorded it to sort of kick off our playing. And then he does gritos in between also, you know. So one, maybe the connection with nature, you know. Two, we do distinguish, you know, like we say, like the Mexican gritos are different than the indigenous Ecuadorian gritos. And what is the difference? And how can we tell, you know, like, somehow. So yeah, it's radical.
there's a lot of stuff written about, you know, the grito, especially from the Zapatistas, and then from decolonizing thinkers or decolonial thinkers like Catherine Walsh, that talks about that you can't stop with the grito. No, it goes in. She has a great introduction to one of her books where she talks about gritos, grietas, and siembras, right? So first is the grito. You have to do that, and it doesn't have to be like, oh, the negativity as Richard mentioned, it's part of, right? And so I think that's true, because that's what we're so informed. That's something that's oppressing us, but it's a conflict that we need to feel and embrace at the same time. So there's that, you have to, and the way you embrace it, I believe, is through the grito. And that's what we also heard to a certain degree with what Michelle just played, but in a celebratory way, right? And then the grieta she talks about is, and we're doing a lot of work with this idea, like the cracks in the system, and to be able to, you have to recognize where those cracks are, identify them, form a relationship with them, and then this idea of like planting in these cracks with, so thinking, as Chell mentioned, a lot about the land itself, the land as knowledge. So just to work off of what you all were saying, I think there's a lot of power in that grito as a way to thrust ourselves forward.
Word. And something that, like, relating it to the last question of like, what is radical listening? What is radical dreaming? I think it's also really interesting how like the grito has to be like such, like the base for it. Like that acknowledgement of whether it's like in a celebratory way or whether like a grito can be like severely painful. But I think that also when we think of, you know, our utopia, like what does it mean to dream when it's not grounded in the stories that our bodies and the land tell, right? So like, I also think that weaving that Daniel was referring to before, of like that collective weaving, like within that weaving is like, how do the gritos inform our dreaming? And how does like that sort of, you know, because I think, and sometimes like, for instance, I think of like exercises of like land acknowledgement, right? Which is also like the acknowledgement of maybe like the screams of the land, right? What do the screams of our bodies, like what are they saying? How do we acknowledge? How do we dream from that? So I also think that like, yeah, that sort of building and weaving with embracing of like conflict is, yeah, really important. And for me, something that like your poems that you all created last week were really powerful in that of not necessarily like offering solutions, but actually like questioning and embracing like conflict. And I wrote a couple of like some of the phrases that really like stuck with me from your poems. For example, you will be you and I will not be you. You will not be me, but we will be here together. Another one is like, is the silence really unbearable or is it the message? And the last one that I wrote down is, I want to stand before an artwork beyond the walls of a museum, you know? So like, I also think that like throughout the creations that you all did in exploring conflict, exploring the gritos, and maybe not necessarily offering paths forward, but also like important questions, there's a lot there. I think and also just like how questions play a role rather than answers.
I really loved how you both have got me to kind of, or all of you've got to reconfigure the relationship between these three parts. You know, and Andrew mentioned epistemicide, it's kind of leading into the gritos, and then radical listening, and then radical dreaming. But as Daniel was saying, and then Shelley, you were just saying that all the parts are kind of connected, and the grito can be the foundation. It doesn't have to be the thing you're going against. It can be the mechanism too. Because yesterday I did a kind of a video reading of a diary that I'd written, and there was this one moment, and I mentioned this when we were talking about radical listening, about Pauline Oliveros is deep listening, and there's this one text that she wrote that's called Pauline's Solo, which I think shows that there's a different order to these things, because in one way I think the grito comes at the end. And this is the text. It's very short. I'll just read it to you because I've taught it in a class, and I feel like there's this moment of, whenever I read it or whenever I listen to it, I feel like it enacts a process of radical listening by the very fact of reading. Anyway, you might understand when I read it. Listening to this space, I sound this space. Listening to the energy of all who are present, I sound this energy. Listening to my listening and your listening, I make this music here and now with the assistance of all that there is. I dedicate this music to a world without war. And it still gives me chills to just, anyway, read it, listen to it, because it's like the grito is the end, but it's, you know, a world without war is the grounding, but I'll just leave it in the...
So we do have a comment in the chat from Mark, and maybe just to add, like, about the gritos, you know, it is about finding one's voice, right? And in the ensemble, we use it as a pedagogy for overcoming the shyness of learning a second language, you know? So we often go outside and we sing loud, and then the gritos are supposed to kind of like find that voice and not be afraid and not be hushed or like speak softly because you're afraid to make a mistake, you know? So that's how we use it. But here, I will read what Mark has written here. El grito as a radical dream involves 1, call and response, 2, personal and collective, and 3, what is and what can be. Use of sound, senses, is central to motion. I like that a lot. We are living through a grito now. Black Lives Matter is a great modern day example.
In the chat, I misspelled grito for grillo. And I don't know, I'm really happy about that misspelling because it just seems to make sense. The griot as the storyteller, as there's a whole other space there with the griot.
I love the happy mistakes. We're all about that. Daniel, you were going to say?
I was just going to say, you know, there's also such a rich linkage to ancestors, and I know that in the Spanish-speaking workshop this afternoon that Chelsea and our colleague Daniela Costa are going to lead. They're going to get into this, and but it just took me back to my one of my trips to Cusco, and you showing that book, Michelle, and somebody I believe wrote in the poem about, wasn't it about seeing art outside of museum or linking to art outside of, and I remember the best tour guide I've ever had, who took me through the Cathedral of Cusco, an indigenous young man who there's, you know, when indigenous were told to paint angels, they said, but then it has wings on it, wings. And they asked, well, describe the wings. And what comes out are the wings of the papagayo, the macaw, which most people look at now and it's like, oh, that's quaint, that's cute. Or that's like almost like defacing the religion to a certain degree. No, it needed to be more majestical and more like an angel, right? But he looks at it. I hope this doesn't go, I'm gonna make a loud sound, but he actually goes like this and goes, ha! In the middle of the church. And I was like, my first thought was like, how, almost like, you know, being like the Westerner, how that's disrespectful here in this church. And then I was like, wait a minute, what am I doing? That's not disrespectful. It was this beautiful conversation that he had with this painting. And I don't know. I feel like the reason I'm bringing this up is that the gritos are part of this dialogue, right? And the gritos also they transcend time, right? And so we have to see uh, uh, the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as other social justice movements, as linked into ancestors and linked into nature, which we call intersectionality right now. But I feel it goes deeper than that. I feel it goes deeper than this kind of academic term that we're using, and goes deep into what you all did. Not to belittle intersectionality, because it's very, very important, but it was this idea of bringing lots of things together, lots of ideas and pains and struggles and gritos and siembras and all that, and finding a way that we can turn those into a new story that works for us. And that's what that radical dream is.
And I think that Mark's comment about the importance of the senses, you know, to go beyond just the words, right? Because I think the words get in our way sometimes, you know, and beyond text, you know, but just to sort of bring in all of the senses, you know, into that expression. And I love the connection with the feathers and the macaw, you know, like just what they represent. And what's amazing is that they reference flying human figures, you know, way back in pre-Columbian art, that have a connotation of transformation, you know, so.
It's funny, I'm thinking back very early on in this conversation when Tamron was talking about her work in Rome, and how this workshop, or the unlearning and the process, is kind of separating, I guess, ideas from, I guess, dominant structures in some ways. So kind of an expectation to go back to certain claimed origins, maybe of a kind of Western way of thinking. And while Daniel was speaking, I was thinking about, there's in Rome, there's the Arch of Titus, is an arch that is a triumphal monument that actually commemorates the destruction and looting of the great temple in Jerusalem. And it has the menorah being taken from that temple. But on the other side of the underside of the arch, it has an image of Titus being turned into a god, and so actually having a winged figure at the top, and even there's actually, as he's triumphing, there's a winged character behind him, kind of showing that triumph. So I guess, you know, in order to, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, what would it mean to bring that call, that grito that you experienced, Daniel, to that space? And that, you know, your conception of the victory figure of the emperor, the angel in a, you know, in its iconography, to suddenly be like, you know, well, whose feathers are these? You know, who gets to decide that this is what an angel looks like, or a feathered figure looks like, you know? And I guess it's that kind of, the meeting of that, you know, and I'm really interested in what those two images came from Tamron and you, Daniel, to then come to us. So we kind of generated that image together. So it was a bit like the word poem to some extent, how we do that.
It seems to me is that the connection that is coming to my mind is with what Mark was saying about the senses, the use of sound and motion, that you don't really get, you know, for Daniel, you didn't have this conception of how majestic a macaw can be until he makes this gesture and the sound, that's where you get this fuller picture of how regal really a macaw is in its natural state when it's flying around, and how that then folds right into these religious images, whether that's an angel in the Catholic tradition or a triumph in the case of Titus, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really is exactly what Mark's saying. This idea of this full sensory experience is what leads to understanding. Yeah.
And so interesting, right, that in Indigenous storytelling and even in Indigenous writing, there is a concerted effort to bring in idiophones, right? So like the sounds like boom, clash, cataplum, you know, like that, and then the sounds of the birds, you know, and things like that, but to bring those into the text as sounds in the mind's ear, you know, of the reader or of the listener. So it's pretty amazing. Alana, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, because I think that there's a strong connection, right, between your work on that which cannot be seen in art, you know, and how you go about describing that. And in some cases, that which cannot be heard, you know, and in the case of radical listening and things that are beyond our limited range, you know, in the Western ear, you know, where there are frequencies and there are notes and there are things that are beyond that, you know. So I wonder if you see a relationship between that, you know, like your work and then this idea of that which cannot be heard.
The thing that comes immediately to mind that I'm working on now, I'm looking at a 16th century manuscript that is a collaborative effort between a religious community and Indigenous scribes, artist scribes. And I've done a survey of all of this. It's sort of three texts. So there's a Nahuatl, Central Mexican Indigenous language text paired with a Spanish translation of the Nahuatl. And then there's images. So the images form a third text. And in those images of the things that are not visible, that are represented visually in these drawings, the vast majority of the invisible things that are represented are speech. So I've been doing a very careful study of the different ways that speech get represented. And it's interesting because the same iconography is used in the pre-Columbian period before the Europeans arrived for very many different kinds of emanations. But in the early colonial period, because this focus on speech, it's really refined to this. This is the main thing that gets represented. And to bring in the image of feathers, speech scrolls would often be represented with secondary elements that speak to the quality of the speech or the quality of the sound, or, you know, the same kinds of scrolls are used for all different kinds of emanations. But so thinking of it in terms of a jewel is added to it that creates the sense of the preciousness of the language that's being used. There's this one really wonderful speech scroll in this early colonial document where a Spaniard is lying to Indigenous people, and his speech is given this very big feather that has all these, it has a lot of down, and down is used in central Mexico to adorn the heads of people who are about to be sacrificed. So it's as though his speech is relating in some way to the lie that is being told leads to a massacre. And so it's as though he's speaking to the sacrifice that's about to occur, even though that's hidden in his language. So it's instead of the heads of the people being adorned with the feathers, the speech gets adorned in this way. And it's this really subtle way of communicating these ideas to this simple addition of this image that in other contexts might be interpreted as a idea of preciousness or the elevated form of speech. In this case, it has this sense of premonition or of what's underlying the words that are being spoken. I don't know if I'm not making a very clear picture of how this all relates, but this way of communicating a secondary set of information is there under the surface all the time. And here it then gets it's depicted in this way of representing something that couldn't be, the words that he's speaking couldn't be fully understood at the time that the message is communicated. And yet in representing it after the fact, this little addition gives it this ominous portent. Yeah.
Thank you, Alana. I just wanted to say that we've just about reached the hour of our Unlearning. One of the aims for Daniel and Chell, the aims of this is that we do limit ourselves to this hour. So it is kind of, it doesn't go beyond that. It's almost like just a drop in time, and it goes quickly and we want it to last longer, but then it ends. And so leaving and ending when we want more is part of our process here. So unless Michelle wants to say anything else, I just want to thank you all, for your presence. Especially Alana, so early there. I can't believe you wake up so early to join us. It's wonderful. But thank you all for being here and sharing. And Michelle, do you want to just have some closing remarks?
No, just to thank Daniel and Chell for joining us, and to thank everybody for a productive conversation. I'm always really struck with how profound, some of the things that happen in this designated time, like for me, carry over for the whole week and really sustain me.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to say anything about the workshop this afternoon, Michelle, or just briefly? Or
yeah, so for all of you, you're welcome to join us. It's going to be a workshop on Identidad y Pacha. Pacha defined as not just earth and land, but time space, right? And that starts at 2:20. It's the same link as the other workshops, so you should have the link
in the Google document that we just sent to. Yeah.
Yeah, and then please be sure to join us. And Daniel, do you want to say anything more about that workshop or any? We also have upcoming workshops at second iterations of the Epistemic Justice workshop later on this month. But I'll let Daniel and Chell have the last words.
I'll let Chell say a brief word about this afternoon, but I'll just say for next week, we've talked a lot about land and then relating that to body and knowing. So try to really be perceiving your bodies over this next week as we prepare for next Friday. And then Chell, maybe you can jump in for this afternoon.
Sure. Yeah, so today we're going to be diving into some concepts of Andean cosmovision to continue to question identity and then also our conflicts. So we'll continue conflict exploring through the perspective, through an Andean perspective. So if you're coming, please bring an element of nature to the space. Where yeah, that's gonna be important. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thanks everybody. See you next week or this afternoon. Maybe stop recording, Michelle.